So, the course is all about water, society and sustainability, which will talk about the relationship between water and society towards an efficient and sustainable future. So, here the first lecture would be I mean it is entitled setting the context, where I would like to establish the relevance that why this particular course is important, why do we need to know about the embedded relationship between water and society towards an efficient and sustainable future. And so, first I would like to begin with the very fundamental question that what water is all about. Now, is it only H2O? Because if anybody asks what is water, then generally people would argue that it combines or it comprises of compounds of hydrogen and oxygen. But then this particular idea that water is only H2O to a great extent abstracts water from the social, political, regional, local and ecological processes or dimensions with which water is extremely loaded with. Now, if we ask what is water to an anthropologist, his answer would be very different from a particular another social scientist, maybe a historian, who would actually define water or perceive water in a very different way. Similarly, how water can be perceived or understood by experts, technocrats or engineers, maybe people who are specializing in technical fields or physical sciences like geomorphology or hydrology, would be very different from people who are actually dealing with social sciences. But the unfortunate part is that in our conventional textbooks, this kind of conventional definition is available, that what is water? It is a kind of a transparent and nearly colorless chemical substance that is the main constituent of earth's streams, lakes and oceans and the fluids of most living organisms. So, in this particular lecture, what I would try to do is I would try to critically interrogate this very meaning or dimension of water by arguing that water is not only a physical substance comprising of hydrogen and oxygen compounds, but there are other additional meanings, there are other significant understandings or perceptions surrounding water. So, yes, so this is a very fundamental question that I would like to raise, that does water have important social, historical and local dimension, which unfortunately are missed in this particular idea that water is nothing but H2O. This is the 9 planetary boundaries framework, a very important framework which Johan Rockström and his colleagues working at the Stockholm Resilience Center came up with. So, they published a paper in 2009 in one of the journals called Environment and Society, where they proposed this particular framework called the 9 planetary boundaries, and this is one of the most relevant frameworks, though it also has been criticized by different social scientists and natural scientists as well, but we will not go into those criticisms. But we will discuss that why this framework is very important for understanding Anthropocene. Anthropocene, that is the current or the contemporary geological era that we are encountering. So, Anthropocene is that particular geological era where it is believed that human activities or anthropogenic activities had played a very important role in altering the major earth system processes like the geologic processes, hydrologic processes, atmospheric processes and even the biospheric processes. So, we are encountering Anthropocene today, and the very important question that really we need to raise today is that what are those non-negotiable planetary conditions that we need to respect in order to avoid the risk of a deleterious or even catastrophic environmental change within the continental or even at global scales. So, Johan Rockström and his colleagues they argue in this particular paper published in Environment and Society that these framework, the 9 planetary boundaries framework is actually not a doomsday message, but rather it is a framework that help us understand the safe operating space for us, like I mean what should be done, how we can really come up with innovative alternative solutions through which we can avert a crisis. Now, if we look into these 9 boundaries, we find that there are this climate change, lost biodiversity as species become extinct, then there are changes or transformations in the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, deforestation and land use changes, emission of aerosols, stratospheric ozone depletion, ocean acidification, freshwater use and organic pollution or pollution as a whole. Now, the whole question is that they updated their findings published in 2009 again in 2015, because again a detailed report came out in Science, where they showed that how the first 4 boundaries had already been transgressed. So, we see that freshwater use, it is still within the safe operating limit. The boundary for freshwater use has not been transgressed yet, but it's it's, I mean, we should not be relieved out of this, because we have to understand, we have to realize that there are strong and deep interactions or overlaps across these different boundaries. So, I will give some examples to illustrate how all these boundaries are interrelated to each other. So, for example, if we take an example at the regional scale, we will find that deforestation in Amazon, of course, it will have or it will influence water resource availability in Asia. So, similarly, if there are changes in the vegetation in the Amazon, and it is predicted that by the end of the 21st century, the Amazonian vegetation might get replaced by savanna type vegetation. So, that will have an effect on even surface temperature in Tibet. Now, Tibet with its changing climate, it will definitely affect again water resource availability in Asia. So, there are around 15,000 glaciers in the Himalayan Hindu Kush region, which stores around 12,000 cubic kilometer of water, fresh water, which is supplied to around more than 500 million people in that particular region, plus 250 million people in China. So, this glacier melting definitely will have its short term impact in increased runoff, but there would be also long term impact. For example, there would be changes or variability in seasonal precipitation, and it would also affect the entire water supply system in that area, with definitely a lot of implications at global scales. So, this is the scenario today, and coming specifically to the context of water, we find that what this water sector, it is manifested with manifold challenges. For example, due to climate change, due to anthropogenic activities, what is happening is that the severity and the intensity of water related disasters are increasing. For example, floods, for example, droughts, and there are so many other problems as well related to the quality of water. And there are many other changes that are taking place, because we are on the threshold of multiple new things. Like for example, what is happening today in the 21st century is that this is also the era of rapid urbanization. Rapid urban sprawl is going on at an increased pace. I will describe it later in one of my slides, but what is happening is that this is also creating a whole lot of pressure on water resource. So, with the change in demographic pattern, there is also a direct change in water consumption. So, we can see that these 3 important components, like the quantity, quality and access to water is very important. So, we really need to think about the quantity of water, that is water flowing from one system to the other, which can be measured definitely using certain units, and the quality of water, and also the another important parameter, another important, very important, one of the fundamental important variables is also access to water. How water is being distributed to people. So, who are the people who are getting more water, who are the people who are receiving less water than the daily requirement need. So, all these dimensions help us understand that water is not it's not simply H2O, but there are definitely other multi-layered complex dimensions that are very much imbricated within the concept of water. So, P. Sainath, the famous renowned journalist, he wrote something called Is Water a Fundamental Human Right, and he wrote this particular piece in context of the droughts, prolonged and protracted drought that was going on in the western part of India, in the Maharashtra region. And so, P. Sainath said that the India is undergoing a mega water crisis, and this is the outcome of growing inequality and also lopsided environmental policies and projects that are sweeping the Indian scene since the last 20-25 years. So, if you take a look, I mean very briefly, today 27% of the Indian villages and 4 to 6% of the Indian urban areas lack access to drinking water. The irrigation sector is also undergoing a major crisis. On the other hand, groundwater resource, it is also it is also declining, getting reduced at a massive scale. So, what is happening is that P. Sainath, again, who is also the author of the bestseller called Everybody Loves a Good Drought. So, he points out that we are facing these water challenges due to numerous factors, including the global corporate capitalist projects that are undergoing, which again include the construction of multiplexes and the construction of malls on eco-sensitive belts, diversion to cash crops and other things like, for example, concretization of pilgrim towns, and also the coming up of the housing, very big housing complexes with large swimming pools on rooftop. So, what is happening is that we find that there is absolute misuse and abuse of water resource. And he also talks about borewell bankruptcies and bottled water industry. I would like to little bit elaborate on this, because we really need to understand water, we really need to understand water not only from the perspective of the physical dimensions. We really need to know about the other dimensions, including the pitfalls or the challenges that are very much there relating to water distribution system. So, for example, in the 1980s, this million borewell scheme initiative was carried on by the government in western India, mainly areas like Maharashtra and Rajasthan, where the arable areas, the farmers were encouraged to dig borewells. Now, of course, one can understand that the rich farmers who could afford to pay the loans, they started digging borewells across these arable lands. Now, what happened is that immediately after a few years, those zones, those regions were declared as successful zones, because the agricultural productivity increased like anything. But after few years, after 2 decades, these zones were only categorized and declared as black and grey zones, because nobody could again dig another borewell in that region, because the aquifer was already finished. So, this is what happened with the million with the so called very glorious quote unquote million borewell scheme initiative. Now, again, if we focus into the privatization of water resources, if we focus specifically into this bottled water industry, then we will find that industries like Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola, they are continuously digging and drilling different parts of rural India, again especially western India, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, etc. And what is happening is that these areas are undergoing tremendous water crisis. So, the groundwater is being extracted like anything. So, in 2003 in Thane, before the massive protests which were led by Kisan Sabhas, Sainath found out, as he was again a reporter, a journalist. So, he found out that like the Maharashtra government was selling water to this bottled water industry at 1 liter water they were selling at 5 paisa. So, this is the situation, and this particular thing, I mean, if we just focus into this particular statement that IPL can afford water and Latur farmer cannot, I think this very statement itself is indicative of what is going on in the water sector so far as the national context, the Indian context is concerned. So, coming to the urban context, like 2007, it is the one, I mean, it is a landmark year, because I mean, there was a massive change, or there was a massive demographic transformation, because for the first time in 2007, the urban population of the world, it surpassed the rural population, of course, and there were lot of implications of this transformation. Now, what happened is that, like with this rapid urbanization or urban sprawl, water bodies were converted into real estate. So, today we find massive real estate speculation going on, and of course, it has its implications on water consumption, and there is a whole lot of pressure on the infrastructural networks, water utilities and water sanitation facilities. This is a picture of our unbalanced urban metabolism. So, you can find out what is happening. So, you can see the inputs and the outputs, and this is again the burning question that who gains and who loses. So, I will give you an example. So, one of the case studies which I would share in due course is that we carried on a study, we conducted a study on what we call water injustice in the peri-urban areas of the global south. So, we mainly focused on Cochabamba in Bolivia and Kolkata, India, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So, we mainly focus on peri-urban areas. So, peri-urban again it is a recent connotation, because peri-urban means areas which were rural yesterday, but which will become urban tomorrow. So, these areas, though they are urbanizing at a faster pace, but at the same time they are not infrastructurally well connected. So, we do not actually I mean the municipality the municipality has not provided water pipes or pipelines and adequate sanitation facilities in those areas. So, these areas are urbanizing without any infrastructural support. So, the famous renowned water expert who is an advisor on water to very many like international organizations and government, Professor A.K. Biswas, Ashit Kumar Biswas. So, he drew our attention to water consumption inequity in one of the metropolitan cities in India, Kolkata for example, where he mentioned that a person living in slum, for example, consumes 50 liters of water per day. On the other hand, like in the CBD, that is the central business district of Kolkata, people consume around 200 liters. So, what is happening is that a poor person is subsidizing a rich person by almost like 150 liters. So, and he is using that, for example, he is using treated water for washing his car or for watering his garden and all that. On the other hand, a peri-urban poor or a slum dweller or a person residing in the squatter, he is not being able to access drinking water, or he is not being able to access water even for drinking purpose and even for performing some of the basic amenities or some of the basic requirements of the daily life, of daily needs. So, finally, like this is the Sankey diagram, which tries to explain like how Cape Town can really move on to a more efficient and water secure, water sustainable future, because we all are aware about what is happening in Cape Town. In January, there was much hue and cry relating to water crisis in Cape Town, and so the government declared that by April, Cape Town has to observe this 0 day. So, what would be this 0 day? The 0 day is that would be that day when the citizens have to consume water less than 25 liters. So, generally an average American citizen consumes roughly 300 liters per day. So, one can imagine like this particular amount 25 liters is a very is extremely inadequate to meet his or her daily needs. So, So there was also a hotbed of controversy relating to why this thing happened, and like what could be the possible solutions to move towards a water secure future and all that. Now, if we a little bit look into the history, we will find out that like why this water crisis actually happened in Cape Town. We will find that like if we take a note or if we take a look into the demographic patterns of growth, into the demographic growth, we will find that in 1995 the population of Cape Town was like 2.4, and that increased to 4.8 in 2018. So, it was or it is a 79% increase in population growth. On the other hand, now if we look into the water availability, if we look into the dam storage capacity, then we will find that the dam storage capacity or the water availability, so that is the main source of drinking water for Cape Town, that only increased by 15%. So, 79% increase in demographic growth or 79% increase in population with 15% increase in water availability or dam storage capacity. So, that manifests, that shows the mismatch between the demand and the supply curve. So, and beyond that, in addition, there was again the problem of protracted drought. So, the drought started getting severe since 2015, and scientists argue that it was also the outcome or the effect of the El Nino. So, again changing weather conditions that is affecting Cape Town and many other regions in the world today. So, on one hand the increase in population, on the other hand drought due to El Nino effect. So, all that to a great extent put a lot of pressure on the water resources, on the water availability. And another thing is also there, like if we look into the water distribution mechanism of this particular city, we will find that there is also a deep we definitely find inequity, we definitely find unequal patterns relating to water distribution mechanism, because like for example 64.5% water is supplied to the multiplexes, to the malls, to the houses, to the flats in the central business districts, in the central in the posh lucrative luxurious areas. On the other hand, only 3.5% of water is supplied to the informal settlements. So, the growing inequity is also very much there in the Cape Town water supply system. So, this is a very interesting diagram which Rebecca Cameron came up with, which she designed and conceptualized, and this diagram, which is called the Sankey diagram, it was first published in one of her papers roughly entitled The Role of Spatial Planning in Integrated Urban Water Management in Cape Town, which was published in 2016 in the South African Geographical Journal. And there Rebecca Cameron, through this picture, she tried to argue that one needs to have a detailed idea about water system and its multiple aspects. So, it is very important to capture the multiple aspects underlying water system of a particular region or a particular city, whatever. Now, she says that like there are so many elements, there are so many components which are otherwise fragmented, but they operate in connection to each other. For example, water use, water supply, wastewater treatment, storm water, etc. And on the other hand, one has to also take into account the quantity and quality of water at the same time. So, here the arrows, for example, the size of the arrows that like proportionally indicate the flow of water, that is how water flows from one process to the other. On the other hand, the color of the arrows that actually indicate the quality of water, including different waters like potable water, treated water after use and all that. So, what we find is that she tries to come up with this idea that if one really wants to intervene with, or one really wants to intervene with the urban water cycle or the urban water system, then one has to have a detailed understanding of the functioning of different parts as a composite whole. So, yes, so this is I think an interesting diagram within today's context, that give us an idea that if one city has really has to make an effort to go for a smooth transition from water scarcity to an efficient water secure future, then to a great extent an integrated approach is the need of the day, the need of the hour. So, this is the final slide for the first lecture. Yeah. So, where I actually say that why we really need to go beyond H2O, why water is not only H2O, as maybe the technocrats or the engineers had understood till recently, but we need to have this very idea that water comprises of both biophysical and social components and aspects. So, the another question that we really need to raise, a provocative question, is that should water be a transdisciplinary concern? That is, why and how natural sciences or the natural scientists and social scientists should really come together, and they should start exchanging among themselves, and how different methods, methodologies, insights, inputs, tools, etc., could be exchanged and could be combined to come up with an integrated transdisciplinary perspective on water. So, today there are very interesting, some interesting creative innovative frameworks that are emerging. For example, we have socio-hydrology in natural sciences, we have hydrosocial in social sciences. So, what can we really learn from them? So, these are some of the things, these are some of the ideas that will be discussed in this course, so that we can really address the very important question that what water is all about. Because if we really want to at least understand the problems, if not come out with solutions, that is the next big step. But at least if we really want to be aware with the problems, with the challenges, then we have to have a comprehensive and composite understanding of water. So, to an extent, like I have designed the course, I mean following this particular schema. So, this slide provides an overview of the course outline. So, in this course I would like to cover the emerging theoretical frameworks as I had mentioned. So, theoretical frameworks across both natural and social sciences, like socio-hydrology, so hydrosocial, and also critical physical geography as again one of the most radical emerging frameworks of the contemporary times. And I would also be delighted to discuss some of the planning and management tools and implementation strategies, including integrated water resource management, e-flows, etc. And of course, all these theoretical frameworks will be padded with so many other interesting cases, case narrative, case studies, empirical findings. I would like to introduce the the students with the empirical narratives, the empirical findings across various examples, mainly from the Indian context, but also outside India, but mainly of course also restricted within the global south. And then this would be important because these empirical cases would also inform the theoretical frameworks in its own way. And finally, I would like to conclude the course with with the discussion and conclusion or concluding section, which itself I am really passionate to really go for it. So, I have named it as radicalizing water research. So, like how we can really radicalize river research, how we can really radicalize water research by combining, by integrating the multiple perspectives and the multiple insights and inputs that are coming up these days. So, this is roughly the tentative overview of the course outline. These are some of the references which would be shared with all of you, and I mean you have to go through some of these references for having detailed ideas about some of the components that had been discussed in the overview lecture. Thank you.